The history of the bicycle from its origins to the bike as we now know it can be traced back to the 1800s. The impact on this machine on worldwide society is without doubt, and this impact continues to grow.
The design of the bike seemed very straightforward and simple over 100 years ago. I mean, even the old hobby horse, which had no pedals, you just jumped on and used your own feet to get along. You still had the basic diamond-shaped frame.
It was not until the 1860s that someone had the idea of the most simple thing, which was to put a set of pedals on the front wheel. The first commercial producer of such machines was the Michaud family in Paris, and they started to produce machines in numbers, and these were designated and called the velocipede. They were still wooden wheels made like cartwheels, a forged iron frame, a suspended saddle, front wheel steering. Eventually the design settled about 1890 into the conventional machine that we recognise today.
Back in 1887, Sir Frank Bowden, who was our founder, bought a small bicycle company on Raleigh Street in Nottingham. He manufactured most of the components that were on the bike, so from the chain wheel, the wheels, the frames, the forks. It's one of the oldest bike companies in the world. The bike would have been quite simple then, so there probably would have been a single gear on the bicycle. A bit more like a traditional classical roadster type bicycle that you still see sold today.
In the late 19th century, there was enormous growth in the cycling industry. The conventional bike as we know it gave freedom to its riders, and the bike as a mode of transport filtered down through society. It would not be long before the competition element took hold. Hobby horse dandies were known to race each other, and formal races on velocipedes began in the 1860s. Racing grew in popularity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the safety bicycle, with a steerable front wheel and a chain drive to the rear wheel, replaced the high wheeler. Time trialling became the English amateur race of choice, and remained so until the 1970s.
Racing became part of the history of the bicycle. Tracks were built, events were organised, riders became professional.
Tour de France is the biggest sporting event in the world on an annual basis, second to none. There's nothing comes close to the Tour de France. Gets the television exposure, gets the viewers on the ground, the spectators. But in the world of cycling, it's the pinnacle.
The race was designed to be grueling, and it was ridden on lightweight but very standard machines, without gearing, with very little help on the road at all for the rider. In 1936, the organisers of the Tour de France threw in the sponge, and gears could and would be used by anyone after that date.
At the same time cycle manufacturers started to look at new technology, Reynolds tubing were at the cutting edge.
1935 it invented a high manganese alloy, which is known as Reynolds 531, which actually became a classic of its time, and in its time it was seen to reduce the weight of a frame by probably about 25%, which would have been a massive change for any cycles back then.
Tubular steel was a vital element in the bicycle and remained so up until the present day, until you start looking at the more exotic materials used in competition machines.
A lot of Tour de France wins right from the 1940s, 1950s, right up to the mid-90s. A number of wins in the Tour de France were on Reynolds 531 or 753 tubing.
The lighter materials, of course, they came during the more modern days of the Tour de France rather than the older days. First of all, it was the 753 took over from the 531 tubes from Reynolds. Then you got Columbus tubing, which was a very light tubing. Then you got titanium building into it. Then they did the mix, carbon fibre for the forks, and then the metal for the frame.
Alors le premier vélo que j'ai eu, c'est en 71. Il devait faire une dizaine de kilos. Après, on a commencé, quand j'étais professionnel, donc, avec du Reynolds 531, donc, qui était déjà plus léger. On arrivait autour de 9 kilos. On est passé au 731. C'était beaucoup plus léger, c'était un peu plus friable.
The other innovation really was the changing of the gears by pushing the levers across on your brakes instead of putting your hand down, because a rider would see your hand go for the gear and he'd out-jump you.
The two bikes that I probably think were influential on bicycle design would be going back to the 1980s. Greg LeMond using carbon fibre frames, and a rider called Miguel Indurain using a bicycle called the Pinarello Sword, which was a very, very extreme aerodynamic bike.
I mean, Indurain's Sword was a wonderful looking bike. I would never have been seen dead riding it, but it won him the stages in the Tour de France. The saddle just went out into space, and then the bike went down that way, and the wheel went somewhere underneath. And he was and the top shoe was sloping down, looked quite ridiculous, but boy, it was fully carbon fibre. These were extreme looking machines, but very effective. He was winning everything he rode. He set the world hour record on the track model. He won all the time trials in the Tour de France on the road model.
The Tour de France is a fantastic testing ground and show ground for new products.
I think for the cycling industry, it's their advert. It's where people produce or they run out their new prototypes, their new products. It's their showcase really, and you know, it's their place to say, look, we're ahead of the game. This is what we're bringing out for next year. Have a look at it now. You'll be able to buy it next year in January or February when you start riding.
Today, science, technology and significant investment push the boundaries of the bicycle industry. For competitive cycling, this must be done within the confines and rules of the Union Cycliste Internationale, the UCI.
The governing body of cycling, the UCI, has in place a stringent list of rules regarding bicycle design, frame design and the products that are allowed on bicycles within competition, and those state very strictly what you can and can't do. And so it's for that reason that the bicycles we see in the Tour de France look the way that they do. It's the reason that they still look roughly like a conventional bike from, say, the 1920s.
These more extreme aspects aside, the bicycle is an increasingly accessible form of transport that will continue to have a growing social significance.
Get more from the Open University. Check out the links on screen now.